this in the full screen? Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me to give the second half of this keynote. It's truly an honor to be here talking to such a varied group of researchers who work in both the fields of paleontology and history and philosophy. Today, I'm going to be talking about India's forgotten fossils, which have largely been forgotten not only by the paleontological community, but also by the people of India at large. I'm going to sort of put this in the context of colonial paleontology in the 19th and 20th centuries when many of these fossils were first found. So I'm not a historian of science, I'm not a philosopher of science. I've written a bit about the history of science, but I'm basically a vertebrate paleontologist. And I've been working on Indian fossils for about the last 8 years or so. So that's me at the Natural History Museum in London, measuring the teeth from an Indian from a specimen from India called Stegodon ganesa. It's a species of extinct elephant. And sort of my interest in Indian paleontology came about because, one, I grew up there. I grew up in Bombay, and I came to the US for my college education and my PhD. But I felt a sense that these were my fossils and I wanted to tell their story, which is why I sort of got into this. And India has quite a remarkable fossil record. You know, the story of the evolution of whales happens in the Indian subcontinent. We've got a rich fossil record of dinosaurs and Permian tetrapods. Some of the largest land mammals on the planet were found in the Indian subcontinent. We have examples of snakes eating dinosaurs there as well. I'm probably mostly going to talk about vertebrates here because that's my specialty and mammals. So I apologize to all the invertebrate paleontologists and paleobotanists, but I don't have a lot of small squishy things or green things in this talk. But one of the things that's very apparent in India is that most Indians don't know about their fossil past. This was very evident in conversations that I've had with people from India. And a good example of this is a conversation I had on Twitter just last week, where I was talking about Rajasaurus narvadensis. It's a big dinosaur from India. And a gentleman who works at a children's museum responded to me and said that he was talking to visitors about dinosaurs and that they're found all over the world. And the young girl came up to him and asked, even India? And he said that, yes, of course, dinosaurs are from India. And she got so excited about this. And she was excited about this because that's where she was from as well. And to make that connection with where she's from and the fossil past was a big deal for her. But unfortunately, this has been a problem for Indians for a long time, including me. So that's me at the Natural History Museum in London in '96, which is the first time I had ever seen a fossil, also including the skull of Stegodon ganesa, which I got to study 20 years after this picture was taken. And so the question that I was sort of interested in is, why don't Indians know about their fossils? What happened between the colonial period when a lot of these fossils were found and today when we have 1.4 billion people who are yearning to know about their past but don't really know much about it. Another thing that's going on in India today is a lot of press on the plight of paleontology, where people are talking about how our fossil heritage is being lost, about how Indian paleontologists struggle to pursue their own discipline. And this has also raised questions for me about why did we come to this place where India just doesn't seem to care about paleontology as much. I thought maybe understanding the history of paleontology in the subcontinent can help answer some of these questions. So let's take a trip back through time, through the 19th and 20th centuries when early paleontology took place in colonial India. So most of the early fossil discoveries took place in the early 19th century, when the East India Company was governing large parts of the Indian subcontinent. This is a map of India from 1837. The areas in pink are the areas that were governed by the East India Company. And the areas in yellow and green are the princely states. The yellow states are the Hindu or the Sikh states, and the green states are the Muslim states. The first fossils were actually found in Burma. There we go. And they were all sort of collected by Europeans who worked for the East India Company or the government in England in some way. And they were all kept in their private cabinets of curiosities. So the Burmese fossils were found by John Crawford and collected there when he was on a diplomatic mission to the court in Burma. Fossils from Tibet started to come into India when East India Company officers who were stationed in Kumaon started to interact with traders who came across from the Tibetan plateau who were carrying these lightning bones, called lightning bones because locals in Tibet thought that when lightning struck the ground, these objects were created, and they were sold as medicinal objects or as trinkets. There was a great fossil field that was uncovered in the Sibalik Hills between 1831 and 1837. And concurrently, fossils started to be found in other parts of India that were controlled by the British, such as in central India and in western India in Param Island. But when I talk about the 19th century, I'm talking about the greatest fossil discovery of its time, and that refers to the fossils from the Sibalik Hills. And the story goes that the British were doing these canal projects in the northern part of India between the rivers Yamuna and Satluj. There were these old canals built by the Mughals and the Delhi Sultans. And the British there in this narrow strip of land were trying to make the rivers and the canals more navigable. And in these canal excavation projects, they started to find fossils. The Raja of Nahan, which is a princely state just north of the British territories in the north, had a collection of fossil elephant teeth. And when these canal officers would pass through Nahan, every so often he would, talk to them and give them one of these teeth. So Henry Marion Duran and William Erskine Baker, who were two officers who worked on the Doab Canal project, went to Nahan and were talking to the Raja there, and he gave them what is now known as the tooth of a stegodon, and told them where it came from. It came from a town called Samruti, which is about 30 kos in a westwardly direction from the town of Nahan. And they went out there and they started to find more and more fossils. Hugh Falconer, who is a major figure in Indian paleontology, also goes up there and talks to the Raja of Nahan. He's a very interesting figure because of all of the people who are sort of involved in northern India, he's probably the most educated of the lot. He was a surgeon and botanist and a geologist from Scotland who went to India in 1831 to be the superintendent of the Saharanpur Botanical Garden. And on his forays in the hills, started to hear about these fossils that were being found by the canal officers. If you like gin and tonics, you should probably thank Hugh Falconer for it, because he introduced quinine to the Indian subcontinent, and the British officers like to add gin to their tonic, and that's how the gin and tonic was born. So anyways, I digress. Falconer also passes through Nahan and he encounters the Raja, who gives him a tooth from his collection and tells him where the tooth came from. And he says that within 6 hours, he found 300 specimens of fossil bones. His co-conspirator, Proby Cotley, who was the superintendent of the canal project, also wrote in 1835 that the hills there were just covered in fossils. And they essentially uncovered this massive collection, which were then stored in these various cabinets in Saharanpur and Daudpur, where they describe, I think, 45 new species of mammal and 8 new species of reptile just from a few years of collecting. One of the most remarkable specimens that they found was this animal called Civatherium giganteum. It's a giant giraffe which had antler-like ossicones coming out of its head. It was an animal that had never been seen by the European scientific community before. Interestingly, Falconer and Cotley decided to name it Civatherium after the Indian god Siva, which is sort of an Orientalist endeavor to sort of look at India's past and its mythology. And Falconer was in particular interested in this. But these fossil discoveries were so great and so remarkable at the time that Falconer and Cotley, not a geologist, Falconer was a geologist, they were both awarded the Wollaston Medal by the Geological Society of London, which was the highest honor given by, which was at the time, the most prestigious society of the geosciences in Europe. If you're wondering about how prestigious this was, other medal winners were people like Charles Darwin, Richard Owen, Gideon Mantell, Thomas Huxley, and Charles Lyell. And when Charles Lyell was giving them the award, he presented it to John Forbes Royal in England, who then took it to India, said that this award was given particularly for the discovery of the fossil remains of extinct quadrupeds in the foothills of the Himalayas, for the paleontology that they did there. And Charles Murchison, who was Falconer's biographer, said that the fossil mammal fauna that they found, this subtropical fauna, was unexampled for its richness and its extent in any region then known. This was, in their minds, the greatest paleontological find of their time. Falconer and Cotley later tried to publish a series of plates in the Fauna Antiqua Sibilensis. It's a massive tome of some of the fossils which were taken to England. But in the history of vertebrate paleontology, when we think about the major fossil finds in the late 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, the Falconer and Cotley collections rarely get mentioned. We oftentimes think about Huffman's Mosasaurus, we think about the Megatherium that Owen described, about Adam's Mammoth and Peale's Mastodon, the two giant proboscideans that helped people conceptualize the idea of extinction. Mary Anning's Ichthyosaurs from the Lies, Marianne Mantell and Gideon Mantell's Iguanodon, the first Neanderthals, Darwin's Punta fossils, Hadrosaurus folkii, which was the first relatively complete skeleton of a dinosaur ever found and mounted, of course, Archaeopteryx, and the famous bone wars in the Americas, which uncovered these massive dinosaurs from the American West. And in this history, most vertebrate paleontologists don't know about the fossils from India. So it's not just a phenomenon that's in the Indian public. Professional paleontologists don't know about this as well. Now, these fossils weren't found in a vacuum. They were all sort of kept in their private museums, but they were also supported by the Asiatic Society of Bengal. So Hugh Falconer and the group of people on the right, who I like calling the Canal Group, because they were all officers who worked on the canal projects, were all supported intellectually by the Asiatic Society of Bengal, which was an Orientalist society founded by William Jones in the late 18th century in Calcutta. And the whole purpose of this society was for the collection of cultural and historical knowledge of the Indian subcontinent. It's a picture of the buildings of the Asiatic Society in Park Street in 1833. It wasn't until James Princip, who was this great Orientalist and geologist and mineralogist, who came to the society as its secretary, that its paleontological collection started to grow. It already had a museum which was established in 1814. Nathaniel Wallach, the botanist, was its first curator. But James Princip was really intrigued by these fossils, which these canal officers were finding in North India, and asked them to send the fossils to the Asiatic Society so that they could be presented to a larger European audience. The fossil finds were published in the two journals that the society put out, the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal and Asiatic Researches. And over time, with Princip's encouragement, fossils from all over the subcontinent came and filled the rooms of the museum. The rooms actually got too full, and unfortunately, due to a lack of resources, decay started to set in the late 19th century itself. Falconer goes back to England in the 1840s and comes back to India as the director of the Calcutta Botanical Garden in 1849, where he goes to work on the collections which are still kept in the collections of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. And he laments about the sorry state of these collections. In 1859, when he is cataloging these collections, he says that none of the correspondences from the original donors were kept or were there in any identifiable shape. There were no labels or marks on any of the fossil bones. They were just all put in heaps in the rooms and distributed in a bunch of cases. Most of the valuable specimens were broken or lost. He attributes this dilapidation to the fact that most of the labels were done using paper and ink, which just didn't hold up in the hot and humid climate of Calcutta at the time. There were no catalogs kept by the curators of the museum. And the collections were all were broken up because at one point Prinsep wanted to divide them all up by geological time, but this endeavor was never completed. And part of it was because the museum really lacked the resources to handle a collection of this size. It just didn't know what to do with it. There was, interestingly, a pile of rubbish in the yard where a bunch of ejected materials, including bones and fossil coral, were just out on the heap, and Falconer found very important specimens just on this heap, and he brought them back and put them together. And his most damning condemnation is when he says that the Asiatic Society has broken faith with every donor from whom it has ever received Indian fossil collections. And so the process of forgetting these collections had actually already started in the late 19th century with sort of the decay of the collections of the Asiatic Society. All of the collections didn't face the same fate. Many of them ended up in England. A lot of these officers sent collections back to their hometowns, and they were then put in their museums. The major collection that ended up in the United Kingdom was Cotley's collection. So George Eden, the then Governor General of India, was this great patron of science in the colonies. He even had scientific salons in his residence. The skull of Sivatherium at one point was presented there. And he encouraged Cotley to send his fossils to a national collection. Cotley wanted to keep the collection intact so that it could be studied much like the collection in Paris was studied by Cuvier in a comparative gallery. He asked the Geological Society of London if they wanted the collection, but he heard back after a couple of years that they didn't have any money to house it. Thankfully, the British Museum at the time wanted to keep the entire collection, so they, along with the Governor General's office, actually paid for the transportation of about 236 cases of fossils from the hills in India all the way to London. This was this long, arduous process of putting them on boats and sending them down canals to Delhi, and then taking them to Calcutta, and then shipping them off to London. The mantle of paleontology was then taken up by the newly formed Geological Survey of India. And while its major purpose was economic geology, it was to go and extract minerals and energy sources, they were still interested in the fossil wealth. And much of this was encouraged by Thomas Oldham, the first superintendent of the Geological Survey, who encouraged people like William Theobald and Robert Bruce Foote to go and collect fossils along with their mapping missions out in the frontier. And this allowed the collection of the Asiatic Society, which was then transferred to the newly formed Indian Museum, to grow. And interestingly, all of these fossils were never taken out of India. They're still there in Calcutta, in the storerooms of the Indian Museum. So while a lot of these collections were taken out, India still has a huge collection of fossils from the Sibalics. It was through the efforts of the Geological Survey that we started to get real depth of the Sibalic fossil collections going back almost 25 million years. Thomas Oldham also promoted paleontology by establishing a new journal called the Paleontologia Indica, which was dedicated to the documentation and dissemination of information on Indian fossils. And as we move into the 20th century, the Geological Survey starts to get more professional and modern when it comes to its paleontological practices. And that starts when people like Richard Lydecker and Guy Pilgrim come into the survey in the late 19th century. Lydecker was the first one to actually go through the collections in the Indian Museum, start to catalog them, start to figure out what they were. The cataloging, which was done prior to this, was done by Falconer in 1859 when the collections were still with the Asiatic Society. And now the collections had grown, and Lydecker put in a good effort to go and actually sort all of this out. He published several volumes in the Paleontologia Indica on the fossil history of India. Once Guy Pilgrim comes in, he modernizes it even further because he puts the fossils in geological context. Prior to Pilgrim, the collectors from the survey were just sort of picking up fossils in the field and saying that they were from near this town or that town. But Pilgrim goes out and says that they came from this strata. So we actually start to have an understanding of the stratigraphy of these specimens, which start to make them more useful to the scientific endeavors of its time. The 20th century was also the time when international expeditions were launched in British India, and there were two notable expeditions. The first from the American Museum of Natural History, led by Barnum Brown, the man who found T-Rex. So Henry Fairfield Osborn, the then director of the American Museum, wanted a representative collection of tertiary fossils at the museum itself so that students of paleontology in America wouldn't have to pay to leave America and go to India to study the fossils of the tertiary, which was sort of annoying because now students in India have to pay to travel to America and England to study fossils that came from where they're from. So, and we can talk about that in the panel discussion. But here's Barnum Brown in India chiseling away at an elephant skull with his Indian assistants. The second major expedition, and there were actually two expeditions from Yale, launched in 1832 and 1835 and 1932 and 1935 by Helmut de Terra, and G. Edward Lewis was the paleontologist during the 32 expedition. He collected fossils on the Potwar Plateau in Pakistan and the Savalik Hills, and the major purpose of this expedition was to understand how Himalayan uplift had affected the evolution of life in the subcontinent. What's notable about the Brown and the Lewis expeditions is that they actually nail fossils down to individual holes in the ground, which was never done before, which makes these collections even more useful for paleontologists. Lewis also uncovered some of the earliest Miocene apes and called them things like Ramapithecus and Brahmapithecus and Sugrivapithecus, carrying on the tradition of Falconer and Cotley of naming these fossils after Indian gods. But what about Indians? All of the faces that you've probably seen so far, the ones who were engaged in the intellectual practice of paleontology, were either Brits or they were Americans, basically white people. But what about the Indians? Were Indians ever encouraged to participate in paleontological practice in the 19th and 20th century? And did this contribute to the decline of the science today? Well, the earliest mention of Indians in paleontological practice comes from the collections made by Falconer and Cotley. In 1840, they talk about the Hindu collectors who they employed, who found this specimen of a fossil monkey in the hills. John Colvin talks about this intelligent man who he had hired, who was good at recognizing fossils and sites and extracted them fairly carefully during his excavating and collecting endeavors for the Asiatic Society. We don't have a lot of pictures of what the Indians were doing in the field in the early part of the 19th century, but we do have photographs from the Barnum Brown expedition. And it was backbreaking work because the terrain of the Savaliks is really hard. You're basically in the foothills of the Himalayas with no proper paths and no roads. And so here's a picture of 21 men trying to move a giant fossil elephant skull on 4 bullocks on a bullock cart. It took them 17 days to move this skull 60 miles to the nearest railroad so that it could then be transported down to Delhi. Here's another picture of Indian laborers who were contracted by Barnum Brown in a dry stream bed in Siswan trying to move another large elephant skull, just by physically maneuvering it out on a cart on this dry stream bank. They had to fill in the irregularities in the path with rocks and rubble so that they could get the specimen down. Barnum Brown here is assisting his native collectors to excavate another large elephant skull. And Clive Foster Cooper also employed, who are now Pakistanis, in Baluchistan when he was excavating the largest rhino ever found at the time. What we can see is that most of paleontological enterprise that Indians were allowed to participate in was the labor. They were employed in the collecting practices and in excavation, in hauling these specimens out so that then the Europeans could study them. The Geological Survey of India was torn when it came to including Indians in paleontology. Thomas Oldham wanted to spread geological education amongst Indians and recruit local Indians into the survey, but this view wasn't shared by all. Henry Meldicott had a very racist view, and he didn't think that Native Indians had the aptitude for acquiring the required knowledge for geology, and they weren't physically capable of geology, even though they were participating in the collecting and excavation endeavors for about a good part of the 19th century. However, some Indians did end up working for the survey. One of them is Pramatanath Bose, who rarely gets mentioned in India, but in the field of paleontology, he's mostly known for being the geologist for Tata Steel in Jamshedpur, because after independence, he went to work with the Tatas and told them about this iron deposit that he had found. But he was educated in England, and because he was educated in England, garnered more respect in the survey. And he even published on some of the fossils that Falconer had collected. Another Indian who was involved in the intellectual practice of paleontology was D.N. Wadia, who co-authored with N.K. Iyengar, who was just a field collector with the Geological Survey. He was a very talented field collector because he actually gets mentioned quite a few times in the publications of Lewis and Pilgrim and De Terra. Other Indian collectors like Vinayak Rao were also mentioned. So by the 1920s and 30s, more Indians seem to have been involved in paleontological practice, not just in the collection and curation in the museum, but in the intellectual practice of paleontology. And post-independence, there seems to have been a critical mass of paleontologists. They all seem to have been men, but brown men nonetheless. But there seems to have been a critical mass to facilitate the foundation of the Paleontological Society of India. This was established by M.R. Sani, who Amelia just spoke about. And so one would think that India still has all of these fossil riches soon after independence. The collections in the Indian Museum are still there. There are lots of people who are clearly engaging in the intellectual practice of paleontology to the point where they're starting their own society, starting their own journal. The Geological Survey is continuing this practice. They have their journals as well, and they're continuing to publish on paleontology. There seems to be this petrification of paleontology in India during this time. These are the cabinets in the Indian Museum, I think in the 1920s and 30s. And this is what they look like today. They look pretty much the same. Collections practices, the museums haven't really changed from colonial times. And in many ways, the colonial mindsets haven't gone away in the subcontinent as well. But the one thing that I've sort of taken away from this colonial history that I've just told you is that paleontology doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists with great patronage. It requires a considerable amount of resources to flourish. Museums like the ones from the Asiatic Society decayed because of a lack of resources. It was the patronage of people like the Governor General and the Geological Survey that allowed some of it to flourish in colonial India. But the one thing to keep in mind is that when the British left India, India was left a very poor country. And so with the lack of resources, it's not surprising that paleontology didn't flourish in the early days post-independence. My hope for decolonizing this field and talking about Indian fossils and the history of Indian paleontology is that maybe one day Indians will reclaim the story of their past for themselves and start telling these stories. They will talk about people like D.N. Wadia and P.N. Bose and M.R. Sani, talk about the riches of Indian fossils and be more enamored with an animal like Rajasaurus narmadensis than an animal like Tyrannosaurus rex, which I think most Indian kids know about. And maybe in the future, 6-year-old kids from India won't have to go all the way to London to see their first fossil. Thank you very much. It's been an honor to talk to you.